you know what happened to the angry Bradars after defeating Tom Pearl? After the events of the Great Pexian-Jitliang War, Medford successfully rebuilt itself into a peaceful utopia and under the leadership of Bradar became the United States of Sijinpex. However, not everything was peachy, as the Jitliangs launched a surprise airstrike on civilians after signing a ceasefire. This was the last straw for the Pexians, and soon the angry Bradars began retaliating with their own attacks. However, this only furthered Jitliang aggression, and the two nations started exchanging minor attacks, such as when the angry Bradars flooded Goon Island, which ruined their poop economy, or when the Jitliangs unleashed lab-grown Lone Star ticks on Medford, which gave them allergic reactions to brisket. Just as Tom Pearl thought he destroyed Medford with the ticks, a giant ball of ice hurled in from the distance. However, this wasn't the work of the Pexians, as upon closer inspection Tom discovers a new island, which changed everything. As Bradar, Wally West and Tiki Tiki cleaned up the ticks, they see a message delivered from Tom Pearl requesting a truce for diplomatic talks. Considering their past, Bradar chucks it aside. However, Tom was adamant on speaking to Bradar, sending in leaflets to the entirety of Medford. After Tom Pearl proposes a truce with the angry Bradars to help them fight a new foe, Bradar is reluctant to accept because of their past. However, as Wally forces him to dig deeper, Bradar realizes that he had no purpose outside of fighting Tom Pearl like Batman and Joker or Gideon to low-tier God. As the angry Bradars take a little trip to Love Island, top Jitliang scientists were already on the case, trying to decipher the origins of the ice ball. As Tom Pearl calls out to his daughter, Fibs, she hands him new unredacted files of the culprit behind the attacks. As the angry Bradars finally arrive to the Sijinpex Love Island filming, Bradar is reluctant. However, Wally West assures him that he'll find his wife here, just like anyone would at a rave or ASU frat party. As everyone pairs up with their respective dates, Wally begins by making his intentions clear while Tiki Tiki shows off his best Tom Pearl impression. But for Bradar, things weren't so easy. As the next round begins, neither Wally West, Tiki Tiki, or Bradar had found their wives yet. As Bradar's next date arrives, it looked like things would go differently this time, since she seemed like a Stacy with elite ball knowledge. However, Bradar couldn't let go of his obsession over Tom Pearl and quickly fumbled the date. And plus he wasn't tall enough because of hypergamy, or something like that. After Bradar learns about hypergamy, he loses all hope in life and begins poisoning himself for an easy way out. However, as he opens the door for Tom Pearl, Bradar quickly regains purpose and ties up Tom. Just before Bradar could vent out his frustrations, Tom informs Bradar of a whole new island that were responsible for the mysterious terrorist attacks on both Goonland and Sijinpex. However, Bradar was too ignorant to listen, prompting Tom to call in his Jitliang agents to hand Bradar top secret files of the island. After learning of this new enemy, Bradar realizes that he could finally become Medford's savior again and gain the town's recognition, and proclaims himself as the lead of Operation Senny's Tex. However, all their resources were owned by Tom Pearl, making him the leader, but Tom Pearl was low-key a pedo, so Bradar was basically the leader. As the unlikely allies head out to form their squad, the first choice was Tiki Tiki, who was a walking bomb with his combusted Tiki Tiki phone, but first they would need to bail him out because he was arrested for being a public nuisance. After breaking Tiki Tiki out, their next recruit was Wally West, who could speed blitz just about anyone and do things before they could perceive it. As they went to recruit their last member, George Cooper, who was chilling in a hot tub 5 feet away, he immediately runs away after seeing the files. As Tom Pearl and Bradar assembled their team to investigate a suspicious island, they needed one last member, someone intelligent enough to oversee the operation, and luckily for them Wally West had the perfect person. It turns out that Wally had a twin sister one summer night. However, instead of being a speedster, she could slow and reverb herself infinitely, allowing her consume large quantities of media at her own pace. As one summer night taught the students of East Texas Tech about string theory like Dr. Sturgis, the students began leaving the class because of how slowed and reverbed it was. As Wally West surprises her with an unexpected visit, Bradar recognizes her as the foy who ruined his life by introducing him to hypergamy. Although the two had a bad first impression, Wally tries to mediate and make a proper introduction between them. However, Bradar believed that she wasn't compatible with the team. As one summer night began talking about scat with Tom Pearl and some Tiki Tiki funk, it seemed like everyone had welcomed her to the team except Bradar. To really seal the deal, she brings out every single piece of media that she fully consumed, showcasing her elite ball knowledge. Although Bradar was still not amused, Wally gets all giddy and the two began acting like Kevertez and her cousin, which grossed out even Tom P. As the angry Bradars go over their secret mission of infiltrating Sijinpex Island and stopping their ice raids on Medford, Tom Pearl accidentally replaces all the files of their plan with films that he recorded earlier that day, and a bucket list of things he wanted to do with his cousin. However, instead of being disgusted, everyone was actually quite intrigued. As they finally got back on track, Bradar reveals the one behind the ice raids, Mary Tucker, a stone-cold widow that broke into insanity after her husband turned their son into brisket and suddenly disappeared. As George Cooper gets into a nervous breakdown before claiming to have never met her, Bradar continues moving forward with explaining his plan to the team. However, they are forced to flee after realizing that Mary sent an ice raid on them. As they all latch onto George Cooper for a Hail Mary, George doesn't last too long and the angry Bradars are forced to grab the schematics of their plan like a parachute. However, that doesn't last long either. As one summer night slows herself down and patches up a contingency plan, everyone manages to make it out alive. As Medford congregates to send off the angry Bradars on their mission, many familiar faces are seen, such as the triplets that Bradar saved and even Ashley. For a mission of this scale, Tom Pearl brings out his finest Jitliang vessel paid for by his Patreon. As the angry Bradars board the Iron Lung, leaving Medford and Goonland behind to stop evil Mary Cooper from taking revenge on George for the Sheldon Brisket incident, Tom Pearl and Phibbs introduces the crew to their captain, Aura Monster Daniel, a master in LARP theory. As the angry Bradars get a quick tour of the LARPing grounds filled with the future LARPers of the next golden era of YouTube, such as LARPaplier and LARPcepticeye, Daniel shows them all of their LARPing tools that they would be using to infiltrate Senny's techs. After Wally West and Tiki begin rubbing Tom Pearl's fluids on themselves and even getting a little taste because Tom made it look kinda good, Daniel introduces the Bradars to LARPify, a machine that could play LARPing audios so that they could practice LARPing in their free time, like on the Stairmaster. However, Bradar was getting sick of all the LARPing buzzwords and becomes one angry Bradar, but just before he could do anything rash, one summer night plays Yara Yara Funk to calm him down. In order to infiltrate the island, they would have to LARP whether he liked it or not. While this was all happening, Tiki was doing his mandatory septic tank swimming. As the Iron Lung finally arrives to Senny's Tex Island, everyone is all ready to LARP, except for George Cooper, who is still too scared to face his consequences. As the angry Bradars land at the beach down in Copacabana, which was playing the new Drake album in a continuous loop, turning the island into a frigid wasteland because of the lack of heat, everyone is ready to stop the ice from reaching Medford except for George Cooper, who began panicking. It turns out that the reason why Mary Cooper became evil and wanted to freeze Medford in the first place was all due to George's actions years ago. Back when George was just 15, he and Mary fell in love with each other, as it was prophesied that the Brisket King would marry the Baptist Queen and have 3 children and lead Medford into times of prosperity. However, George eventually got sick of his son Sheldon, so he turned him into Brisket before running away to live a carefree life. As the angry Bradars berate him for causing this whole mess, George could only admit his wrongdoings before running away again. Although their soldier boy was gone, Bradar could only move forward with their plan because they had come too far. However, as the team shows Bradar their new plan that they formed without him, Bradar began feeling left out and immediately turns to his coping mechanism, being one angry Bradar, which isolated him even more. As Bradar left to complete the mission alone, one summer night accompanies him because she actually kinda liked him. However, Bradar was too blinded by anger, as if his head was all quiet on the frontal lobe. After Bradar decides to be a little attention whore and leaves the angry Bradars to see their reaction and waited for them to add him back to the group chat, the angry Bradars completely ignore him and proceeded with their plan to infiltrate Sijanpek's fortress by LARPing their way in. Although their design was very human, the guards began to suspect that something was up due to their uncanny, uncoordinated movement. As the Pexian guard does a 360, Tiki prepares for the worst. However, the guard just wanted to see if they were compatible for Sijanpeks. As the Pexian guards permitted them entrance, the team breathed a sigh of relief. However, their mission was just beginning, and they would have to keep their cool. As Bradar finally reaches the tip of the Dettlemik cannon, they could hear Iceman from all the way up there, and Bradar prepares to go in and turn the speakers off. However, Bradar didn't account for the rope's length, forcing one summer night to slow and reverb so that she could save him in time. After already being a nuisance for the entire mission, Bradar decides to continue coping and wasted even more time. As Bradar hung wedgied above the guards in a vulnerable position, one summer night makes him bite the curb to further his humiliation. However, one of his Hubig pairs fell, putting the entire mission in jeopardy. After Bradar risks his life trying to turn off the new Drake album, which was slowly freezing everything in its path, they are met with the second strongest Pexian behind George Cooper, Eugene Nix, who was a result of centuries worth of selective breeding in order to retain the best genetic traits. Meanwhile, as Tom Pearl and the rest of the team were LARPing as a Pexian trying to find a way in, an opportunity arises as a guard heads to the bathroom, which was Tom's expertise. As the angry Bradars try not to arouse any suspicion from the guard by going to the stall right next to him, Tom orders Phibbs to grab the card. However, they accidentally grab his Digin pick instead, but luckily for them the guard kinda liked it. After the close call, Tom orders Wally West to scout out their surroundings for the keycard. As they reposition, Wally West uses his spit game to imitate R. Kelly, and the guard finally finished his stream and turned his back, allowing Wally to hold E and pickpocket the guard. However, the keycard was attached to a cord, forcing Wally to let go and cause a chain reaction leading to the guard's retirement. As they made their way into the speaker room, they were faced with even more guards. However, the guards had less critical thinking ability than the average 2026 TikTok comment section, allowing Wally West to get a good look of their surroundings. After seeing Bradar and his sister in captivity, Wally immediately tries to speed blitz them in a fit of rage. However, he forgot that he was still in the LARP, ripping apart their disguise. Despite fumbling the mission, the guards were still jamming to Iceman, allowing them to slip away. As Bradar wakes up strapped to a latex floaty in a vulnerable position. Mary Cooper finally reveals herself as the one behind the attacks on Medford. However, this wasn't the normal Mary Cooper. This was the freaky evil Mary Cooper from an alternate dimension. As Mary began laying out her plans of leveling Medford to make space for a bunch of Mormon megachurches and bricks and minifigs, Brodar can only watch in pure anger as Mary started playing Dubist Goot Ganoog, causing Goonland as well as Medford to go down in flames. As the Pexians celebrate after genociding the entire island, Brodar tells Mary that she was doing too much. However, Mary reminds him that this was all his fault by not evacuating everyone when they still had the chance, even though it was their ancestral homelands. As George Cooper comes back home to recharge on some brisket, he begins to reminisce of his family, while Brodar began having an existential breakdown, and questions the purpose of his anger if he couldn't even save his Bradars. As Mary rallies the Pexians to destroy Medford and instate a Baptist theocracy, one summer night is able to free them just in time as Tiki breaks down the doors. However, time was running out before total Medford death, and they needed a plan fast, and luckily there was someone that could slow and reverb infinitely, giving them all the time in the world, and it was none other than One Summer Night, the key to their victory. After the angry Bradars devise a plan to stop Sigenpex from launching massive vibrating sounding beads from the Dedelmic to wreak havoc on Medford, Wally West is up first, disabling the flock surveillance system in a matter of seconds, while the Jitliangs led by Tom Pearl and BB Nose larped around the Pexians. As Tiki carefully maneuvers past the guards, Brodar gets really close to having Sigenpex for the first time. However, he just read the situation wrong. As Tiki distracts the guards with the original Yara Yara funk performance, getting them more riled up than Knicks fans after the comeback. One Summer Night asks if Tom Pearl was ready to pave the way. However, Tom misheard her and pulled up in a cute but not too slutty rave outfit. After Mary Cooper finds out that Brodar and One Summer Night escaped their latex floaties before she could punish them, the alarms go off and the guards began returning to their posts. Meanwhile, after Brodar and One Summer Night perfectly timed their jump, allowing them to get inside the buzzballs to stop the operation from the inside, they suddenly began rolling down. After Tel Aviv almost loses their favorite artist BB Nose, One Summer Night checks up on Tom to make sure that he was playing his part. However, they accidentally break the lever after Phibbs uses her weight to pull it down. As time ticked down, they would have to move faster than how everyone forgot about the hentai virus, and luckily for them they had just the guy. Just as the angry Bradars thought they managed to stop Medford's demise, it turns out that the Dedelmic didn't even have a scratch on it, and Mary Cooper rounds up the angry Bradars for a blood eagle execution, but first she wanted to look them in their perfect faces as she leveled their home. However, speaking of perfect faces, George Cooper arrives just in time, landing like some sort of mighty eagle, before getting on his knees to show Mary how much he yearned for her like the niche Jeff Buckley song. As the two went back and forth like a high school talking stage, Brodar and One Summer Night began scheming, using Wally West's speed to set up a bunch of fishing lines over the Dedelmic like a group of certain people did in Manhattan. Back to Mary and George, Mary reveals that Missy was knocked up with a bastard, which would have never happened if George didn't run away like a low-tier god. As Mary went ballistic on the Dedelmic, the beads almost break through the fishing line, but luckily some kids from Medford High somehow ended up at the crime scene and returned the beads back to their sender. However, that meant everyone would have to evacuate or else they'd be eviscerated. As Tiki shields everyone from the blast, the Dedelmic collapses and almost everyone makes it out alive. However, as Mary looks for George, she is devastated to lose him a second time. After the angry Bradars successfully save Medford by destroying Mary Cooper's das of meal dough, as Mary rises from the rubble, she immediately looks for George as a second option. However, instead she is devastated to lose him a second time. Luckily, George instinctively got into the tornado drill position thanks to his reflexes of a veteran, and managed to tank a universal threat while shielding Missy at the same time. As Mary held Missy like the aliens, George began showing off his tattoos that he got of Mary when he was 15 to take advantage of this momentary vulnerability, and to no one's surprise, George's charm prevailed. As Sigenpex and Jitliang unite together to attend George and Mary's second wedding, Brodar, being handed the role of local Baptist pastor by former Pastor Jeff, oversees their union in matrimony. However, George got his hot damn in before Brodar could finish. After all the formalities were concluded, Brodar is chosen to give the man of honor speech. However, Brodar didn't take the disrespect from George too well and decides to hard launch his relationship with One Summer Night first before delivering his speech, thanking his Bradars Tiki and Wally West, the Jitliangs, and Tom Pearl, and most importantly, his hero George Cooper. In the end, George got back with his family, the Jitliangs and Pexians achieve everlasting peace, and Brodar was no longer an angry Brodar, instead he was just a Brodar.